In 1982, Walt Disney Productions was in serious trouble. It was the era of Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Disney films were no longer drawing audiences into theaters as they once had, and now they desperately needed to reinvent themselves. Disney found its salvation in a radical new film called TRON. Led by the fearless first time feature film director Steven Lisberger, the cast and crew of Tron turned the Disney studio upside down and forced not only Disney into the modern film age, but all of Hollywood. Yes, Tron is the granddaddy of CGI animated films, and it celebrates its 40th anniversary this year on July 9th. Tron has influenced CGI animators worldwide. For example, it was John Lasseter that acknowledged that he said, without Tron, there would have been no Toy Story. Yes, Tron is the very first film to really introduce computer simulation, cyberspace, and computers to the world. It's the first film in a whole new fantasy environment. I mean, this wasn't outer space. This wasn't dragons and such. It was set in cyberspace. And the effects that Tron pioneered in that film proved that it was well ahead of its time. But it would take Hollywood another 10 years to really catch up and to fully embrace the computer graphics. And now, as you know, they're everywhere. But it all started with Tron, and there's nothing quite that looks like Tron. And so today we have brought with us together an outstanding panel. We have the associate producer, Harrison Ellenshaw. We have the animation director, Bill Croyer, the co-visual effects supervisor, Richard Taylor, John Van Vliet, the effects animator, and Chris Cassidy, the effects animator. All of them to talk about the making of, the creation of this wonderful film from 40 years ago, Tron. Let's start with Bill. Bill, how did you get involved with Tron?
Well, I had been training at Disney as an animator in the classical hand-drawn way. And Steve Lisberger blew into town and said, I have a new idea for a studio and I have some great projects in mind. And he tried to lure everybody at Disney away to his studio. And I was the only sucker who went. I was not interested in doing Black Cauldron at the time, so I decided I'd try Lisberger Studios. I went off and we did a movie called Animal Olympics, which was a really fun, hand-drawn film. We did the whole thing in Venice, California. And as that film wrapped up, Steve came to us with an idea for another film. And he said, this is going to be something like you've never seen. It's a story about a guy who goes into a video game. And that was the genesis of Tron. And in the little warehouse in Venice, while we were finishing Animal Olympics, we started to come up with the conceptual ideas, the visuals, some of the storyboarding test sequences for this movie that would be called Tron. And then to my surprise, Steve sold it to Disney and back I went to Disney. Only this time, instead of leaving as an assistant animator, I returned as an animation director because I was Steve's animation director in Animal Olympics, so I inherited that title on Tron. Disney wasn't happy about me leapfrogging in the chain of command, but Steve said, look, that's my guy, you got to take him. So that's how I came back to Disney on Tron. And at the time, it was an extremely primitive day in computer graphics, as you will hear from Richard and John and all the rest of the guys. Technology wasn't great, but in essence, it was really an animated film we were talking about making, because we were talking about making a frame-by-frame film, and that was a culture that Disney understood. So when you asked to order 100,000 colorless, they didn't blink an eye, because that's like ordering cells. But Tron, for all its innovative technology, started out in the very same way that Snow White started out. It started out with drawings. People started to draw concepts and people started to storyboard. And the storyboards that we did on Tron were the same types of storyboards that you saw in all the Disney films. I happen to have some of the original storyboards from the film. That's actually a Mobius. Mobius was storyboarded with Jerry Reese and I. And we did storyboards you can see about, they're this size. They're not, and this is the light cycle chase. And it was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of drawings done with markers and pens. And it was important for us to storyboard the light cycle chase and all of the sequences of Tron as precisely as possible, because you have to realize that in 1980, there was no animation software. Computer software had developed a way to build models and to light models and to color models, but nobody had come up with software to move things around. So on Tron, we literally had to simply render things in place 24 times to get 1 second of movement. It was a pretty crazy way to do it. When we storyboarded these things, as you can see, we tried to draw them quite accurately. We would number them. We put the frame number. We put how many frames that the cameraman should shoot that storyboard under camera. And then we would go ahead and we would storyboard the entire sequence. And if you look at the upper and lower frames, you will see that the final product that ended up going through the entire computer process was almost identical to the storyboards, because we literally had to be so precise at visualizing, because you couldn't make a mistake. You couldn't go back and do retake, retake, retake. You had to basically really understand what you were trying to make the first time around. And then as best as you could describe that to the computer in a way that the computer would reproduce it close to your vision. I'm not going to play this entire bit because we don't have the time. But the trick with the whole thing was trying to get this information, the visuals, into the computer in a way that the computer could understand it. So what we did is we basically started coming up with diagrams to describe how the things work. This is a light cycle diagram, and you can see it had yaw, pitch, and roll. And so we defined to the computer guys, when we said it hits 110-degree pitch, that means it's leaning to the right about 10 degrees off 90 degrees vertical. And we literally had to take graph paper and graph out the pathways of how things would move, and then mark down figure out the distance that they would move on each particular frame. So these would be the graphs that we would give to the computer guys at Magi Synthevision or at Triple I, and this is what they would follow. You can see in this case, I have a simple turn of a light cycle, and it seems pretty simple, but remember, that's not a B-spline. That's like just a graph we drew, and you can see all the frames marked of where the thing would be on each frame, et cetera, et cetera. This was a camera move, a camera that rose up and came down on the back of the bike. Pretty primitive, but at the time, there was no other way for we as animators, we naturally imagine things in 3D space, and we naturally imagine movement. So when we imagined it, it wasn't a big leap for us to go ahead and draw diagrams that showed exactly the movement we intended, not just for the vehicles, but for the camera itself.
Well, one of the things, if I can inject something here quickly, one of the things that Bill and Jerry incorporated in those storyboards that was significant is that with computer simulation, there were no limits to the camera moves or to the objects. So we could do camera choreography unlike anything that had ever been done by hand, all the perspective changes, and they really incorporated that in their design.
Well, actually, yeah, we did a combination of things, because we wanted to keep a sense of realistic film staging and cutting, so it would feel like a real filmed piece. But then, as Richard said, we would exploit things that no one could do yet with cameras to add some zing to it. So anyway, this was the thing. So that I said, there's no such thing as motion software. We had to essentially render each bike in place. And to do that, we had X sheets. And for those of you not in animation, an X sheet is short for exposure sheet. And in traditional animation, you'd have a sheet like this, and every line going across is 1 frame of film. You can see the darker lines indicate every 8th frame. So 3 blocks is 24 frames, that's a second. And if you'll notice on the left, for a light cycle, as an example, would have 6 variable movements, X, Y, Z for movement, and yaw, pitch, roll for tilt and turning. And we had to give a value for every one of those 6 things on every frame of the scene. So that means 144 values for every 1 second of screen movement. And since we had 15 minutes of computer generated animation, that's 900 seconds of footage with an average of 2 vehicles and a moving camera. That would have been 322,000 hand recorded values. Pretty tough for 2 guys to do, but we came up with an idea, and it was great. There was 1 computer on the Disney lot in 1981, and that was this computer over here on the Oxberry, and it was developed by a guy named Bill Tondro, and it was a simple computer that would do splines and would drive the little driver dials on the bottom of the platen. You know, if you understand animation, there's a platen, this table where the drawing set can move this way, and it has little dials. Well, Tondro hooked up servo motors to those, and he hooked up a computer, and I realized very quickly, well, gee, I can go down and I can enter numbers in that computer, and the computer will smooth out the motion for me. And that's what happened. So we ended up using that computer to generate all the curves and everything in our movement. Unfortunately, when we generated those numbers, there was no way to digitally put them into the computer. So the poor guys at Magi and Triple I had to hand enter the numbers. And here you see a guy doing that. Only this particular guy happens to be Chris Wedge, who went on to found Blue Sky and direct the Ice Age movies. So it was a pretty good start of a career for him, entering the numbers on TRON. And of course, once that was done, it was filmed on a film recorder. I mean, again, remember, there's no computer screen, there's no monitor that the animator can look at to preview motion. There's no way to do that. We basically gave them the coordinates to render our objects 24 times every second. They would go ahead and do that, advancing the film in a film recorder. And at the end of the day, the first time we would see anything move would be in 70 millimeter projected on the soundstage. And that's why we only got one extra take on, because it was such a problem to fix things.
It seemed to me that as an animator, you really were at an advantage. You understood those principles of animation, and that's really what it wasn't a computer scientist that had to do that. I mean, it's a combination of both. But you, as an animator, knowing frame by frame action, was able to break that down and present that now in numbers and such. So there's a real advantage, it seems to me, in working on this film.
Well, I don't think it could have been done any other way. You know, what I notice about a lot of kids today is when they're working with computers, rather than think first, they go in and they just start moving things, and they look at it and they change it, they move it and they change it. And if you'll notice visual effect shots, it's not unusual to have 120 versions of a visual effect shot. Well, as Richard will tell you later on, in TRON, we didn't get redos on these shots. We had everything in TRON is like the second take or the third take. So as you're pointing out, it was critically, you know, when you're hand drawing an animated scene, it's a lot of work. So before you sit down to draw 40 drawings for a scene, you're really, really pretty darn certain about what you're intending to do. You've already done thumbnails, you've already thought it out. And that was the way TRON worked, is we really thought out these scenes. We storyboarded them very carefully. We did story reels to look at the storyboards. We all agreed, yes, that is what we're going to do. And then we sat down and described literally to the frame and to the inch exactly how the motion would go frame to frame. And without that ability to mentally pre-visualize and then articulately describe, you never could have got that kind of footage on the screen with the technology we had at the time.
We didn't create by change because we had no Control Z.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But just to go back even at the genesis, it sounds like it was originally going to be an animated film. When did it change from that idea of being an animated film feature to being a CG?
Back on Animal Olympics, we started doing hand-drawn animation tests using the backlit techniques that Richard Taylor had developed, where we would take the drawings and we would make codaless and we would backlight them, and we would have neon characters, but they would be hand-drawn neon characters. I have images later, but it's basically a black sheet. It's like when you take a photograph of something and it, you know, and then you have a black line on white, but the close-up is a negative of that. It's a black sheet that has a clear space where the line was. The original tests from TRON had these neon-looking animated, hand-animated characters moving around. But at that moment, we often say it was like somebody turned on a bug light on the porch in the middle of the summer, and every bug that was attracted to it, every human being in the United States that had an interest in computer graphics somehow got wind of this project and started calling the warehouse on Andalusia. And among those people was Alan Kay, one of the 5 Apple Fellows. And we started to attract these people saying, no, no, no. Computers have come far enough where you can actually use computers on this movie, and you should start considering it. And that was when Steve Lisberger made that switch and said, we're not going to do this as a hand animated thing. we're actually going to try to do it with computers.
Let's talk to Harrison and bring Harrison Ellenshine here. How did you get involved with Tron? You were associate producer and you were there in pre-production months before shooting began. What was your first task in getting involved with Tron?
Well, I was very fortunate because I had an office at Disney, and I was working on, I think, Something Wicked This Way Comes. So I wasn't technically a Disney employee. And one day, Tom Wilhite, who was instrumental in getting this going, came into my office and introduced me to Steven Lisberger. And I guess I had a little bit of street cred because I'd worked on Star Wars. And, you know, and suddenly the whole thing turned to talk about cell flopping and backlight compositing. And at one point it wasn't going to be backlight, and doing these tests. And it was overwhelming, I think, for all of us. But to everyone's credit, we didn't give up, because everybody in Hollywood said, you guys cannot come out in July. You will not achieve this. And I think that's what made it so crazy. It's like, oh yeah, watch this. And it was such a team effort. And I basically became the, Donald Kushner, the producer, and myself, we were kind of the conduit to Disney to tell them it's going to be okay. And right, we just need another $10 million. And then it'll be fine. And so I remember going back about 3 times to Ron Miller, who was head of production at that point. And he by the 3rd or 4th time, he'd say, well, you know, we get past his personal assistant, because we knew he came in. Ron was a sweet guy. His claim to fame was he was a football player, married the boss's daughter. And so he'd be reading the sports section at 7 o'clock in the morning, and we'd come in and I'd show him, Donald and I would show him wedges and with a loop, because we had no footage. And it was a little embarrassing, because we were spending money, you know, kind of not crazy money. And Ron would go, okay, what do you got for me now? Look at these wedges. And he'd take the loop, and he didn't quite know where we had to take a light box and he didn't quite know what was going on. But to his credit, he stuck with us. He and Tom Wilhite didn't give up. And the rest of the studio just was like, who are these hippie, you know, weirdos that come in late and leave late?
Well, what was that environment like for the crew of Tron in working at Disney?
I think it's hard to say, because you're breaking new ground. You're doing stuff that nobody's ever done before. There's a lot of self-doubt, but there's so much raw talent coming from doing commercials. And, you know, Rich tell you about Bubbles. And so we were trying to keep moving forward, reinventing the wheel. And every now and then we'd go off to a sidetrack, and then we'd have to go, oh, no, this isn't going to work. What do we do? How do we back up and get back on track? And it was a thrilling time. I will never forget it.
Now, you are not just the associate producer, but you're also renowned as a matte painter. What mattes did you work on? What's one of the most famous mattes, or was there only one matte on?
There was only one. It was kind of a cameo.
Right.
And it was, I think it was must have been Steven's idea. So it's a live action shot where Bruce Boxleitner is in a cubicle, and you see all these cubicles going on forever. And the whole concept was, well, this is kind of like the grid and kind of like this. We had an excuse for everything. You know, it was like, well, why are you doing it this way? Because that's the way it is in this world of Tron.
Well, you're dealing with a graphic concept that was very unique for its day, that never been done. So trying to explain that to others must have been, how do you explain the color blue to a blind person, right?
Well, I don't know if you explain anything because everybody, my eyes would glaze over. I'd go, what? What are you going to do? And I think it was just, running behind the train, picking up the pieces, trying to stay ahead of the train behind you. And it was very difficult. And it was the first, probably one of the first movies where I really lost a lot of sleep, because it was just like, oh God, this isn't working. We got to do something. And I remember Steve, it's an apocryphal story, but at one point, Steven Lisberger called me up, and it was 11 o'clock at night. And he was freaking out because the cells coming from Cuckoo's Nest in Taiwan, which were all hand painted, were sticking together. And the four effects animators were, camera people were going, this is not working. And so Steve said, I came down to the studio in my bathrobe, which is not true. And I said, we got to call, we got to figure out. So we called Taiwan, and God, what was his name? Oh, great guy.
Arnie Wong.
Yeah. So, and said, stop everything. We'll figure this out. Simple solution, drying shelves. But that was everything. Nothing was easy on Tron. The boxes to hold the codeless, well, we didn't have enough, and to hold the animation. So some of us had to go find better boxes that wouldn't crush, because when you're piling boxes up like this, they're thin boxes, and they would crush, and then everything would. So I became an expert in boxes.
Well, there's a lot of challenges. Before I bring in Richard Taylor, I want to just bring in Bill again, Bill Croyer. Bill, you have a picture of your Harrison was talking about the wedge. You have a picture of the wedge you want to show us?
But that is a wedge. And if you notice, it was a really painstaking process, because you would take one of the transparent codeless, in this case, it's a picture of Tron, and you would use a number of different filters and a number of different colored gels and a number of different exposures and a number, you'd have a star filter or a blur filter or a fog filter. And you would literally have to shoot each of those with the multiple exposures of the camera. And then somebody would have to stand at a table and look at that. And that's basically what a wedge is. And thousands and thousands of these sheets were shot on Tron. And remember, for every different color on the screen, a different wedge has to be shot for just that color under camera. And the same thing if it has a different glow or a different effect, like a star filter, you have to put that under camera and you have to shoot all the possibilities. And then the poor scene coordinators would put a loop and they would lean over the light table and they would look at all of these and they would pick out the one that they wanted. And that would be how they would end up.
If anybody understood what was going on with the graphics, computer graphics of that period, it was Richard Taylor. And fortunately, Steve reaches out and brings in Richard. So Richard, tell us about how you got engaged and got involved with Tron and your role in understanding and moving these challenges forward.
Well, my career before Tron went through different phases, but one of them was that I was at Robert Abel and Associates, and I had invented as a result of a light show that I had. I started using Hi-Con to project it, but I ended up putting imagery under an animation camera with a light box with registration pins, so that you could make multiple exposures with different filters and different color filters and different diffusion filters, both on the artwork and on the lens. And you could animate the exposure to make things brighter, so you could make light pulse. But basically, it was like painting by number with light. That's one of the best ways to define it. And that process I had developed, and that ended up being what we converted to create the look of the live action characters in the electronic space. And then the computer simulation, I had been working with Terry Malick for about a year on a project, and I had started working at Information International as creative director there with Gary Demos and John Whitney, and had done the effects for Looker, a Michael Crichton film. And what people don't understand about that time is, when you say computer graphics, before Tron, generally what anybody saw as a computer graphic were line drawings or things on monitors in Star Wars that were kind of graphical and so forth. But what Tron introduced was raster graphics, and that's when the computers started imitating the effect of light hitting an object, excuse me, and creating a dimensional object, like a teapot sitting there. So the computer started making, rendered objects. So all of the recognizers, the light cycles, all of those things in Tron were raster graphics, and people had not seen that before. And that was a huge breakthrough. And that's what Bill and Jerry and so forth were able to use, because the other things that computers could do, making imagery that nobody had ever seen, was there's no physical limitation to the cameras. You could be in infinity and then come flying right down to the wheel of a light cycle. And likewise, there was no limitation to the physics of an object. Objects could pass right through each other and do, impossible things perfectly. So everything we did on Tron, from the way the characters were backlit, to the way the effects animation was done and backlit, the way the backgrounds were done, the design of the world, the cyberspace, which was one of the most wonderful things about getting to work on Tron, was creating a new fantasy environment that nobody had ever seen. And we made it of light, and light was energy and life. And that language, to communicate it to the cameraman, the animation cameraman, to communicate it to the computer technologists at III or Magi, we had to invent the languages. And exposure sheets that Bill showed you one are the language of animation. And each one of those vertical rows is a separate pass. For a single character to be standing there in a scene, there were 4 basic exposures. There was the exposure of his overall costume. There was the exposure of his circuits. There was an exposure for the skin tone on the hands and the face. And then there was an exposure for the whites of the eyes and the whites of the teeth. And those last 2, the whites of the eyes and the whites of the teeth, had we not done that, because we had done some without that, and the characters just looked horrible. They looked dead. But with the whites of the eyes and the whites of the teeth. So 4 exposures for one character just to stand there doing nothing. And then you're changing those cells every frame. And so if you have, 2 characters in a scene, that's 8 passes. And there are many scenes with 4 or 5 characters. And then the effects animation are other backlit exposures. And the animation cameraman, like Glenn Campbell, had to change all this artwork based on the exposure sheets, layer upon layer of artwork. For example, when Tron is first rezzed into the electronic world, and he materializes, and then you see his view of his hand looking at his arm, and the circuits are glowing, and there's animation moving through the circuitry. Well, all of that animation moving is done by hand with reveal animation and exposure changes. So it was incredibly labor intensive. Everything we did, that's why I say Tron was really made by hand. It's one of the reasons there'll never be a film done like that again, or that'll ever look like that again, because now we have all these programs, you know, After Effects and Photoshop, and the list goes on, and Blender and Maya, but none of that stuff was there. There were no PCs when we made Tron. There were no animation programs, and every line in the film, like on the bridge of Sark's Carrier, the big map, or that image behind you, that Tron logo and that graph behind it, I basically drew those things by hand with mechanical drawing tools and a rapidograph. All the lines on the game, or and you know, the designs on the helmets and things, we basically did all that stuff by hand. And there's a big misconception about what was done on the film by computer. But generally, when the film was introduced to the world, nobody understood computers out there very much. And so they assumed that we just kind of typed in information and the computer made all these decisions. But a computer is no different than a piano. They don't play themselves, you know. So like an animation camera does not create the animation that it sees, or pulls the trigger. It's all really hand done. And Tron had massive amounts of labor, hand done labor in it.
Well, there's great collaboration with animation and what was happening in the early days of CG with your computer imagery as
Right.
well. You brought in, though, John Van Fleet and Chris Cassidy to do visual effects. So I want to bring in John and
Let me
John first.
finish answering the question
yes.
you asked me, how I got involved. I had become creative director at Information International Incorporated, which is one of the 3 or 4 companies in the United States that made raster graphics. There was NYIT, there was Magi Synthavision, and Information International, and Digital Productions in New York. The Able Studio had not done raster graphics yet. So anyway, Stephen was out doing his research to see who could do what, and he approached us at III and introduced himself and the film and the concept, and then asked us to do a test of a simple design they had done for the MCP, and we did that test, and he was very happy with it. And one of the things is that I had created this, my team and I had created the Information International sample reel, which was really noted because it had this Adam Powers juggler and had all these scenes from Looker and film logos and things we'd done. And the whole reel had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and was made by a filmmaker. And all the other companies, it was just flying logos and things. So when Disney, Ron Miller and them saw basically, well, who's going to do this simulation? And they saw this stuff. It's like, well, does anybody out there know how to make film? But the III sample reel, they went, oh my God, there's actually some people out there that can actually design and control this stuff. So that was a big breakthrough. And so I got involved when Steve came and we pulled that test off. And then he realized I was the person who had done all that candy apple neon stuff at Abel's, which he and we all collaborated together to come up with the final process for creating the characters in the electronic world, the treatment of the live action of Tron and Flynn and Yori and Dumont and all of that.
Wow. Well, now it might be the good time to bring in John and Chris, because what we're looking at is combination, it is collaboration of animation and computer graphics. And computer graphics back then, I mean, so rudimentary to what it is today. But you bring in John and Chris because they're traditional visual effects animators. John, what was your role, and or maybe give us a little background about what you did before you came onto Tron and how you.
Okay. Well, the legal parts of my pre-Tron days. It was actually a little weird because not too many years before that, I'd been in the Air Force. And one of my jobs, I was a graphics guy and a draftsman there. So I spent a couple of years basically training nuclear bomber crews on how to more efficiently do their job. And then I worked with engineers. So I had a background in backlight and airbrush and doing blueprints and engineering stuff. So, and then I had a short time up north working for a guy named George. And then when I found out about TRON, I saw it of all places, a little blurb about it in the newspaper with this very cool picture. And I managed to get a phone number and call down there, and I got eventually routed to Richard. And I realized, oh my God, I got the 7-Up guy, you know, which was to me like the holy grail. And I was like, I'm talking to the 7-Up guy. And I basically gave him my pitch that, you know, yeah, I really think we should talk. And he was gracious enough to say, yeah, sure, kid, come on down. Let's see what you got. So I flew down from Northern California, went in with a couple of pieces of film I shouldn't have had, showed him some stuff, showed him some artwork. And then he took me into the, I think you guys called it the concept room. And with all the drawings on the wall of was Sid Mead, Mobius, and Peter Lloyd. Anyways, all this stuff on the wall, and it was damn near a religious experience. And I remember thinking, I will kill to work on this because this is what I was born to do. And by the end of the meeting, I convinced Richard that I was a good risk, and he basically said, "Okay, I'll consider bringing you on." And then I said, "Thank you very much." Flew back up north and got quite drunk, and quit the job I was on, and basically moved into some horrible housing, and the next year and a half, whatever it was, did the show. So
Well, it seems like apart from Bill and Richard and Harrison, it seems like everybody those guys were already experienced in their field, but now we're bringing in people that had no idea, and they'd never seen anything like it in a movie set, or there wasn't even a set. There was no set. What am I saying? I mean, it's the first film inside a cyber environment, and so there's a lot of challenges in conveying what Richard's vision is and Steve's vision is, and working that with Bill and getting that all together to create something that was so collaborative and had never been done. Chris, your role in working on Tron and getting in Tron, what was your background and how did you get involved?
Well, my career was just starting out at the time, as was John's, Van Vliet. But I had been specializing in effects animation, in fact. John and I both were lucky enough very early in our careers to fall into this Lucasfilm empire. I had made laser beams on the first Star Wars movie. And I think by that time I had also animated the laser beams in the snow battle sequence of Empire Strikes Back. And John, your first film was Empire Strikes Back, right?
Yeah, that was the first one.
Yeah. So we were young guys who really lucked out and had these really cool first jobs. I don't have any interesting story about how I got on this. I think Richard Taylor had seen my work somewhere. Richard, I think, passed through Pete's company one day and was looking at something on the Moviola that I had. I don't recall, or was it the Sony Walkman commercial we did with Digital Productions? Something Richard had seen. My recollection is that Richard Taylor just called me and said, "There's a."
Yeah, I think I gave him your name.
So is that right? Okay, great. Thank you.
And not in vain.
Thank you. That was a good gig. I appreciate that. Yes.
Well, we were extremely lucky to get you and John, because you were the alpha animators.
We had effects. We had experience, both of us, in doing backlit animation, which was very rare. And as you say, mostly came out of Able, where all this had been pioneered and invented and engineered. And so Richard obviously brought in all those people from Robert Abel, who knew all this, but from working on Star Wars, doing laser beams and flak bursts, explosions, sparks, things like that, I was a little bit experienced with effects animation. And so this was a traditional animation job. One of the things I loved about TRON was being on the Disney lot, being in the Disney animation building, being in a wing of the Disney animation building where these wonderful historic Disney films had been made. And here we were, trying to think how many were in our department. John, do you remember?
It was, I think we topped out around 20.
Yeah.
Yeah, for most of the time we were around 15, but I think we hit around 20 towards the end.
15 sounds about right.
Yeah,
And-
I was looking at some pictures and it looks like there's 15 to 16 people there.
Right. And John, I think you and I were the only guys that had come from some qualified science fiction film type background. These other guys, as I recall, they had pulled them from Saturday morning cartoons, from Filmation.
Yeah, yeah, there was the amount of people who understood both, you know, graphics and backlight and airbrushing and stuff. I mean, it was like hardly anybody.
It was you and me,
Yeah.
I think,
He was definitely a Saturday morning kind of guy.
were leading him along.
So
For the shots, you created the glowing circles, the light cycles, the discs.
So the light cycles were out of the CGI. The where we were involved is the transitions, and I always, you know, the magic moment was one day Richard walks in with this huge transparency of one of the light cycles. He has that in the box, and he pulls out a picture of I guess Flynn and holding a broomstick, and he says, I got this guy here and I got this light cycle here. I need you to get him in the bike. Call me when you're done. Now,
Yeah.
see, this is where all those drafting skills came in, because I literally made up all these parts and did a series of wipes and fades, and it was over 70 some odd passes on this. This is Glenn shot these. And these are the ones he would call me at 3 in the morning and go, oh, I don't think this one's right. And he was usually right. So.
Everyone always thinks that that's computer generated, but that was hand drawn by you.
Right. Yeah, because the light cycle was actually made by Magi and done with Boolean modeling, not polygonal. But that's some of the work that we did on the film, was to make work done by Magi and Triple I and hand drawn, whatever, to make it all fit together in the same world and for you to believe it. John and Chris did some of the most, you know, iconic animation. That transition is one of them, but one of them was when Flynn gets zapped by the MCP and sucked into the computer when he's with the grid, and you see his fingers disappearing and all of that. And the work that they did, Chris and so forth did on the Crystal Cave when they're drinking the liquid energy, and every disc that's thrown and the streaks that follow them and all of the interactive light all over everything throughout the movie, all of that was hand drawn, and those streaks of those discs were done so perfectly with airbrush grads on them, no pixelization or anything. But if you look at the film and just look at the effects animation alone, when Clue is being de-resed by the MCP and the animations are going across his face and he's deteriorating into bits and falling apart, and then eventually, like the other characters that they came up with, their circuitry fades off into the floor or the wall. And in the scene where Dumont is being tortured by Sark on the carrier and saying, I think I'll just keep you around for laughs. But that animation, you know, surrounding him, all that, you know, light animation and the effects across his face and their bodies and seeing their skulls, and honestly, what the effects animation department did is just brilliant.
People really need to understand that aspect, that It was supposed to look like it was made with a computer, but
Right.
it's not. It's made
Right.
with drawings and cells and photos. Yes, there's computer graphics in there, but all the rest is traditional animation.
Correct.
If I could share one more thing, just to augment what Richard was saying earlier, there's this, a lot of people don't realize that the whole thing was, you know, black and white, and the sets were all black and white. You know, this is, you know, that's a set. It was just plywood painted with black. And the only thing that was going to show up would be the characters, and everything else would be replaced by computer graphics. So these codoliths like this, you could see the animation pegs on the bottom. That's a what were they, 11 by 17-inch codoliths? So there'd be a print, but then they would make, so you'd get a positive and a negative.
There you go.
Right.
Like that.
But that
And then
negative,
you have-
that
and then-
negative, as you can see, the negative is entirely black. There's no gradations of gray or anything. It's entirely black and clear, so that you can expose those circuits and make them color, add filters. So yeah, every pass has to go through a Hicon window.
So if you had a background like that, you'd have to have a holdout mat of the character to protect that area where the character was going to be placed. So you'd put a holdout mat down to hold out that part of the background. And then you'd have to do the reverse and hold out everything but that area to start putting the colors of the character back in.
Wow.
And this is what these crazy people in Taiwan painted, is they painted out everything that was not going to be lit on that particular pass. It just totally
The
insane
face,
stuff.
right? And
Yeah.
you know, we had a wedge book, I called it. I drew a test pattern that had dots and lines and so forth, and it was Hicon, and every animation camera, and in the end there was 18 of them, everything had the same light boxes. All the scene coordinator had a different kind of light box, but all of them similar. And the wedge book, what we did was every color filter, every kind of diffusion filter, be it steel silkscreen mesh or a diffusion filter or opal glass on the artwork, all of those things were wedged on this pattern. And these books were about 3 inches deep with these pages. So if you said, all right, in this scene, he's going to have blue circuits and there's a normal for that color, and then it's going to glow, they could go in there and see exactly what the exposures were and then write those exposures in to create the look. So we had a wedge book, it was called, for reference for every color and every effect. Scene that Bill was showing about the holdout and so forth, the background image was a large color transparency that was made from a computer. We would shoot 4x5s with the computer and then enlarge those to make, so all of the backgrounds in the electronic world were large transparencies and then other effects animation laid over them. So that is, so this was being composited in the animation camera. There was a large transparency, that's what that is, with registration pins, and then those other elements are laid over it. So the backgrounds in themselves, we had a whole background department that did nothing but make, Peter Lloyd was in there drawing what the what the lines would be, and we do composites on a 4x5 camera with a backlight, you know, 10, 12, 15 passes, and then make large enlargements of those for the backgrounds.
And some were done by paintings by Jesse Silver, and then made those into ectochromes and added different things to it. So there were a lot of different methodology in, and as Richard said earlier, it all had to match. It all had to look like it was the same world, done by the same person. So everything, and that was, I think, one of the biggest challenges. You know, you didn't want to go to a scene and say, well, so-and-so did that scene because it doesn't look like the one before it.
Well, Bill, where was that, the picture of the interior of the tank? Was that you, Bill?
Yeah, it was me.
Yeah. So all of the sets that the actors wearing white costumes with black, all of the sets were all black on black, so they were self-matting. Everything was covered with this black Exeter paper that was kind of flocked, so it really absorbed light. It wasn't reflective. This particular scene right here happens to be one that is unique in that was Sid Mead's design, and we literally made that set with all of those white designs on the set, and that was unique. Yeah, and that rotated, that centerpiece rotated, so that was a physical set that actually had those designs on it. And then we went in and used reveal animation to isolate different areas and pulse the light and do different things to animate them. So when you see these things in the background animating, or that liquid he's drinking, or any of that stuff animating, that's the animation department doing reveal animation. There you can see, if you go back to that moment there with Jeff, the difference that character would be without the white of the eyes and the white of the teeth. There's no way. They just look, you didn't buy it at all. They were frightening looking.
Also, if I may add, you had to build the set. So it was a set that had to be built by hand, and the art department had to integrate this kind of thing to make I never understood how they did any of it.
Well, you know, what was astonishing for a lot of this, when we were getting the transparencies or the character work in, was the guys who had shot it had pumped enough light in there to keep everything in focus.
Oh,
It just must have been a tremendous amount of light, and then they still had to try to make sure that nothing came through in the black areas. And it was just like, you normally, when you get a DP, you don't want everything to be like perfectly flat lit, but they managed to pull it off.
Yes.
And it was, and I was always astounded how great it was.
So Bruce Logan.
Bruce Logan.
Bruce Logan, that's
the
right.
Director of photography, who had worked on 2001 and other projects, and he was the perfect guy for this. But as he was saying, we had to just blaze those sets with light to make the characters as flat as can be. We weren't looking for shadows. We made an aesthetic decision about the look of the electronic world. If you notice, there are no shadows, but there's interactive light. We couldn't really do shadows unless we would have animated them, and we didn't really need them because, you know, it was a world made of light. So where are the shadows? We animated a shadow here and there for an effect, but no, we opted for interactive light, which the animation department just blew us all away with.
Yeah, you know, it was funny trying to communicate to the animators, because most of them, as we were saying, were not coming from a background of doing effects work. So trying to explain to them that everything here is light emanating was a tough one for people to understand, because in a normal world, you've got shadows, you got highlights, you know, there's a source, but here it was like everything's a flat illumination, everything's generating light. If that object isn't generating light, it's dark.
Right.
But
so that set that you were seeing there with all the white designs was unique. All the rest of the background sets, there was just black, except for if there was a console that Yori was punching numbers on, it was black and it was matted out by its presence being there. But every background was designed and hand drawn by Peter Lloyd and the background department, and then they made elements, airbrushed elements and high-con elements, and had a whole department with a big light box and a larger format camera doing these single stills that were ectochromes that were then enlarged big enough to be cells. So the backgrounds were, Peter Lloyd did a phenomenal job in designing those backgrounds.
I'm
In
sorry.
that little clip, you saw this character called the Bit, which was this little character that was like the Tinkerbell character. And that was a classic case of an example in the movie of, you know, flying with whatever the computer could or could not do. You know, in 2022, it's hard for you to imagine that the term interpenetration of objects was an alien idea to us at the time. We had never really heard of that. Of
And
objects
you don't notice
through each other. Why don't they bump? And so when we saw this happen, we thought, well, maybe we can make a little character out of this, and that's why
we had to get rid of the bit at a certain point because we didn't have the money or the schedule to make it hang around for the whole part. So it just goes.
Well, the bit was done by Digital Effects in New York, Judson Rosebush's company. And as Bill said, what we did was we made two different shapes, a yes shape and a no shape. And when it would say no, it would become spiky and red. And literally, we would just take the no element and put it inside the yes element, and then just expand it in scale, and it would just interpenetrate and take over. So that was the kind of stuff you could do with computer simulation. I mean, when we made TRON, the types of imagery that we could do is what we did. There was nothing organic. There was no foliage. I mean, the amount of time it took from TRON to Jurassic Park was half the time I thought it would take. But no, it was a technomechanical world, and we designed with what we had. And we were so lucky that Stephen was able to get Sid Mead, Jean-Claude Mobius, and Peter Lloyd, incredible designers. Mobius did a lot of storyboarding and a lot of costume design work, and Sid did a little of everything. But we were so fortunate, and it all really boils down that Steven Lisberger was a very terrific director and let people do what they could do. And he was super collaborative and not over controlling, and that's how we got it done.
There's a certain scene where they're looking at video. I think the guys are in Sark's control room, and they're watching one of the screens. And we had to do, this was supposed to be like a video derez effect. So this is supposed to be video glitches. So instead of, I just hand drew these video glitches as the screen derezes. This is just Sharpie ink and a ruler on paper, and it gets more and more dense. It's actually a wipe where this gets denser and denser until it reveals, but this thing goes by in a half a second or something like that. But I sat there with my ruler and drew all these with a Sharpie. Here's an explosion scene. TC8 sparks.
TC8. I remember it well.
Oh yeah, good old TC8.
TC8.
TCO13, remember that one? Let's see. So where are we here? So this is one of the explosions inside the tank. I think this is explosion inside the, when Flynn, I guess, is in the tank and he gets hit and there's this spark, and then we put this filter that Richard came up with, this diffraction grating filtering, or the mesh. Remember that, Richard?
Yeah, steel silkscreen mesh.
Steel silkscreen, yeah. So imagine each one of these pieces of paper is laid with a giant piece of film, a giant sheet of Codolith film, and copied. And I remember this number from back then. I don't know whether it's true or not, but there were $8 per frame for the Codolith. Harrison, I don't know if you guys remember the budget, but I was under the impression that there was $8 per frame spent turning each one of my drawings into a giant backlit Codolith piece of film. So every bit of effects animation that you see in there was done this way. Now, you remember the MCP, the barber pole, the candy striped barber pole that's flickering? That was 4 frames. So here's the 4 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you turn that into a negative and the black places are clear and you put a heavy red filter on it, you blow it out with some diffusion, you get that flickery barber pole. So this is just a cycle of 4 frames whipping by. There were quite a few of these different setups, different places. Here's some little sparks. These are the light bulbs exploding on the solar sailor, I believe. Here's an explosion. Maybe that's Sark's head. I can't remember. That's one of the bigger ones. But
Sark's head.
yeah, I'm the guy who blew up Sark's head and made the sparks come out of his head just as he's dying. I don't know. Can you see that?
Great.
Yeah, we can see it.
And you
Yeah.
got paid to do this?
Huh?
And you got paid to do
Yeah,
this?
yeah. Not only that, but I learned
Well-
how to do it on this job.
Well,
I learned on the
you know,
fly.
the fact was that Disney made, I don't mean Disney, Kodak made for us all of this pre-punched film, both high con and the continuous tone,
Right.
because we had photo roto machines, took the 70mm negative, projected it down to this continuous tone film, exposed it, and then that film went through a processor, and we had these big film processors. So that would come back as a continuous tone positive, and then that was contact printed with the registration pins to high con film and flashed from above with a separate light. And then once you had a negative high con, you could contact that again to make a positive icon. So, but all of that film was custom made for us by Kodak.
One more scene for you. Remember when Flynn first enters the computer, he's approached by these guards that have this big baton, and he's whacked on the shoulder. And this is that effect where he's being whacked. So it's the first frame.
So Chris, would you shoot a pencil test of this action before you'd ink it?
Yes, we would. We would send it to the Disney camera department and they would shoot it in black and white. They do a 2-pass thing. First of all, it got turned into Codolith first. What do you think? I think we turned him into Codolith before we looked at him. John, do you remember?
You wouldn't do a test
Well,
before you went to
In the first portion of the film, we were testing stuff, but it got so crazy on time that literally as soon as we put it on paper, we would push it directly to Codolith and go, we get what we get, and if it's really dumb, we'll do it again. But
Yeah, that's what I remember. I remember just
Yeah.
off drawings. You could give them a stack of drawings and they would spend the money on it before we'd seen it.
yeah,
That's-
it was the time became more precious than anything else.
Yeah.
So it's
So I have most of the scenes that I animated for Tron. I have the paper on them.
I mean, an interesting fact is that all of those frames, high cons, continuous tone, all those things, every frame of all that was flown to Taiwan, where it was painted and by this cuckoo's nest, that's all of the Asian names at the end of the film, and then flown back to the United States for the scene coordinators. So literally every frame went to Taiwan back.
3 to 4 months, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it was insane.
Crazy,
So
crazy.
it's,
Show you a filter box.
Oh,
Mhm.
nice.
Ooh, cool.
Filters,
Wow.
colored gels.
Yeah, wow.
Here's the 57, the 29 red.
Yeah.
These are real relics.
oh, where's the K23A? That's my favorite.
Oh yeah, the 23A.
I've got
So Keith, so you know, those are all Ratten filters, the
Yeah.
kind of gel they are. So they're very, very optically clear
Unreal.
because you're putting them in front of the lens. They're Ratten filters that are used, generally they were invented to use in optical printers.
A34 purple,
So
favorite purple.
they're just luscious color.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can see
That's how
that.
color was added to Tron, boys and girls. Colored
Lots
gel.
of color.
And most film students today have never held a piece of actual film in their hands.
I have to mention somebody, John Sheely.
Yes.
Uh, John was, at a certain point, we would say in dailies, when something wasn't quite right, we gotta reshoot it and do all this and balancing light boxes, and it would be a Sheely fix. So give it to John. Go
We
for
had he had his own little group. Myself and Harrison would, with all of the crew, we'd watch the dailies, and I would make a decision about whether it was a hero or whether we had to fix something on it. But we could only run a scene through the process X number of times and get it all done. So if there were too many light leaks or different things that we couldn't figure out after trying to composite it its second time, then it became a Sheely fix. And he had to take it with this group of people and just pound out a solution. And it was essential. There were a lot of things like that. I love Tron because there's an expression that I have used for years when I see something that's really beautiful, great art, something just totally, it will remind you of something you've never seen before. And that's what Tron was.
I thought you were going to say this is the film that's going to melt the Naugahyde off the lazy boys of America.
Of Middle America.
Oh, Middle America.
Yeah. Well, that was another expression I had, but
you had a lot of expressions.
I think jumping off the cliff and building our wings on the way down.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
We plan to have the first Easter eggs because I could think of a few. You know, remember the grid bug, which was the only scene in the film that has a truly hand animated character. That was done by John Norton, and that's kind of an homage to what Tron was going to be. It's the only scene in the film like that. It has nothing to do with anything. You just kind of dropped it in. And then the Sea of Simulation has the famous Mickey Mouse
Lake
cavern in there where you fly over Mickey Mouse's head, and very few people catch that. And I think technically Tron features the world's first digital stunt double, because when Flynn falls down the beam at the end of the movie off the carrier, that's a digital model of. So I guess technically you could say that's the world's first.
Well, there's a scene where Sark is looking at the map of the world in the bridge of the carrier, and there's Pac-Man there chomping away.
Fortunately, nobody really noticed it because there would be copyright issues.
You know,
That's
I confess to throwing that in there, and I expected it would be caught and taken out.
No, I think when we discovered it, we loved it so much, and never told the studio.
We loved it.
Yeah,
Got away with that one.
One of the weird things about this picture was, unlike a lot of shows that are micromanaged to death, I mean, one of the reasons I believe it had so much great energy and input was because nobody really knew going in how to make it. And so it was one of the few times you got on a show where they gave you a target and said, we got to get here. We're not quite sure how we're going to get here, but this is where we're going. And you got a chance to basically beat through the bushes and figure out a way to do it. And that's why so much innovation happened at every level.
We had a lot of wonderful talent, and we always had a sense of humor working on the film. We didn't take ourselves crazy seriously.
That was sleep deprivation.
Well, you know, our division in the animation building, we were like, you know, Hell's Angels compared to the rest of the studio, where they were wearing bow ties and brogans, and we were all in Levi's and leather jackets and playing rock and roll, which I don't think ever echoed through the halls of the animation department before we got there. But and then the rest of the studio, looking at the storyboards and things, they just could not figure out what we were doing. And we would start really grinding about the time they were all heading home. We could watch the studio, all the cars leaving, and that's when we were going into the night shift. And because we worked damn near 24/7 to get it done in the 6 months we had.
You know, Richard, you're going to tell us about 1982.
Yes, well, again, 1982 was a really amazing year for science fiction films, which we've already listed. And for the audience who doesn't know the process, the way films are nominated for Academy Awards in special effects and some other categories is we have what's now called the bake-off. And what happens is the films that are being considered cut together 10 minutes of footage, and you have a spokesperson who stands up in front of the audience at the Academy Theater, and there can be several hundred people there, but within those 100 people, there's a committee of 40 or less that are the ones who eventually will meet later and vote on which films will become the final films to be considered or to be nominated. So, you know, Richard Edlund and John Dykstra and Trumbull and people like that were standing up there for their films. When I got up to answer the questions for TRON, first of all, when anybody would stand up to answer questions, there would be lots of them. Questions from knowledge. Were those explosions 300 frames per second? Were those models quarter scale? You know, how many opticals did you, all that kind of stuff. When I stood up to answer questions from TRON, nobody raised their hand. And I finally said, there must be some question about this film. Finally, a tentative hand rose and said, what kind of camera did you use? And it's like, what do you mean? Do you think we had some kind of newfangled camera or something? And I proceeded to explain that we shot it in 65 and that we had animation cameras looking at the artwork on Oxberries, and we had pin registered cameras in the film recorders at Magi and Triple I and digital, and altogether maybe there were 25 cameras, traditional cameras, and no more questions. Finally, one other person raised their hand and said, did you make any models? And I said, yes, we did. We made some study models because we had to make set pieces that were going to match computer simulated images. And then I started to realize, you know, the problem is nobody here is willing to raise their hand and say, how does a computer make those pictures? It's like when you're in grade school and, you know, nobody understood a problem and you're just waiting for that one kid to say, hey, I don't get it. How does it? And you go, oh, thank God. Well, nobody would do that. Nobody would say, how did, so I started to explain how the models were made. No, we did not make physical models. We made mathematical models in the computer in two ways, by adding and subtracting primitive shapes like Magi, Boolean modeling. And then the other way was that Triple I, we drew out orthographic views of the solar sailor and divided it into polygons, put it on a big digitizing tablet with a mouse that was about the size of a, you know, about the size of a big. And Art Durinsky would put that in, and then we would spend weeks because computers were so slow. Every time you put something in a computer, type, enter, and then like that, it would take, you know, a minute for the picture to come up on screen. And then and they'd say, is that right, Richard? And I say, well, yeah, but you got to move that 2 degrees to the left and make it 5% brighter. And they type and type and type and type and then enter, and it would chicka. And so it was so slow to feedback on all aspects of it. And so it was very time consuming on every level doing TRON. But so I tried to explain it a little bit. I said, basically the computer is imitating the effect of light hitting an object and bouncing the light rays to a theoretical camera. And we call that ray tracing. Well, that was it. And I went backstage and Richard Edlund was there, my good buddy. And I said, God, that was so weird. I mean, I felt real hostility out there. Those people were really pissed off. What do you think's going on? And Richard said, I think they think you cheated. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I think they think the computer did the work. I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. And he said, well, I think that's what's going on. So I sent some people that were there from our team to ask people coming out of the theater what they thought. And that's what they said. Oh my God, you know, the next thing they're going to do is John Wayne, and there goes our jobs. And all they did is type that stuff in there. Oh yeah, like you typed in, I want a solar sailor that looks like it's gossamer. It looks like it was designed by Jean-Claude Mobius, that's traveling on a beam of light, camera left to right, enter. No, but that's literally what they thought. And Edlund, who was on the committee when he went to the vote for the final thing, that's what came up. They kept saying, no, John can't, they use the computer to do all that. And that was the generalization. They used the computer to do that, and therefore they cheated.
Well, we were young, if I may. We were young. I was in my early 30s, I think, and the committee was old timers.
Yes.
We were the, you know, those wacko new kids on the block think they're so smart. And they, as you say, they were hostile. It's like, yeah, you think you're so good? Well, hey, we did Ben-Hur.
Yeah, well, we did a Mad Mad World. I mean, what do you know?
Yeah,
They just saw a threat to their jobs.
That's right.
absolutely. And it's just the way it is.
And by the way, they were right.
Well, it's the Academy. I mean, God love, but to not get a nomination, I mean, crazy. And as Richard says, yes, the competition was great, but come on, given
well, in the end, the Academy Award, the three films that were finally nominated were Blade Runner, Poltergeist, and E.T. And E.T. or Blade Runner won best special because Bambi science fiction.
Wow.
But, it just was, as you said, the committee was Linwood Dunn and these guys from optical houses and model shops, and they just they really did not. They were worried about the future and their jobs and all of
Yeah,
that.
well, where are they now?
That's right. That's what I'm saying.
That's right. Yeah, that'll learn them. But when you think about Tron, it might not have won back then, but it has changed the world for artists and filmmakers and art itself and style and music and culture as well.
Well, I think of it more now as an art film than anything.
Let's talk. I got to get an expression from each of you about this. How did Tron change your careers? How did it affect your lives? And not just that, the broader picture. How has Tron changed the world for artists and filmmakers? Let's start with Bill. Let's go with Bill.
Well, I guess from the guy who was completely, I felt so privileged and fulfilled to be a 2D hand-drawn animator at Disney. I thought I had reached the pinnacle, and it was. I mean, you couldn't go higher than being an animator on a desk at Disney. That was the peak. And along came this new thing that was brand new. And Steve Lisberger said, to us back on the warehouse, he said, we'll do things that no one's ever seen on the screen. And at the time, I'm very happy that I was fully appreciative at the time that I had a chance to come into work in the morning and do something that possibly no one had ever done before. And that's something that's a really rare thing. It's really blessed. You're really blessed to ever get that chance to do something in life. And so for me, that was just an exciting fulfillment. And I just caught that bug of the innovation of that industry. And luckily, that period of the 80s was the time when it really exploded. And it was so much fun to be part of that. It was so a great thing. And if it hadn't been for Tron, I would not have been a part of it. So I've always been very, very, very thankful that happened, that opportunity happened for me.
Harrison?
I agree. It's interesting because the unfortunate thing was Tron came out and it didn't do very well. And it was ahead of its time, and nobody quite understood, what's an MCP and what's this, that. It was too much to wrap your head around. And Disney was unable to get a roadshow engagement. So it opened in 22 little theaters and nobody went to see it. And that was crushing. I mean, I was, God, it was very difficult because I had worked, as we all had, crazy, crazy hours. And when it finally was done and having to go through a lot of, last minute things, arguing with Stephen about getting rid of the love scene, which pained me terribly. But that happens on movies. And then when it came out and nothing happened, I went because I thought, what do you do when you work on a film and it's going to be a huge hit? Well, of course, Spielberg, Lucas, they go to Hawaii. I said, okay, I'm going to Hawaii. So I went to Hawaii and I called after the opening weekend and I talked to Dick Cook, who was head of distribution and a big shot at Disney, and a nice guy. And I said, so how do we do? And he said, I think it was 3.5 million, 5.5. And I said, oh, well, that's not very good. He goes, no, it just was dead on arrival. And I really, it broke my heart because we were very certain to one of the first films, there were others as well, to get everybody on the credits at the end, and even the people at Cuckoo's Nest, and it was Chinese characters, and I don't know what those said. It could have been anything like "Die Imperialist Pig, Yankees." I don't know, but it's still there today. And so this was our kind of falling off the cliff at the end, and I can't complain because I've been fortunate in so many ways, but this is what makes it for all of us, everybody here, so meaningful. It was pushing, it was Sisyphusian task, pushing the rock up the hill and then it rolled back down and go, okay.
Well, we can't always measure success just by dollars and cents, can we? Because here it is, 40 years later, we're still talking about it. Richard, what did it mean for you and your career?
Well, it was seminal. The technologies that came together and the people that came together, the idea was brilliant. The movie was never understood by Disney and was incredibly poorly marketed. As Harrison said, people out around the country did not see it coming. Those of us in Hollywood did, we knew about it, but it opened in second-rate theaters. And there's the whole story. We had the cover of Newsweek and Time, or no, Newsweek and Newsweek and Time, and we had made the covers, backlit composite them, and the essence of those two magazines, they were going to come out at the same time, and the cover of each was a TRON cover, and it was a huge coverage of the first film to use computer simulation and all of that. But Schultz resigned over the weekend, and when the covers came out on Monday, it was Schultz on one and Haig on the other. It was Haig that resigned, actually. And that was the equivalent of about $12 million worth of marketing had it been on the cover. Being on the inside and people discovering the article, that's not the same. So there were things like that along the way, and they did not spend the money to really go out and market the film. They just didn't really understand it. So I, like Harrison and everybody else, was deeply saddened by its lack of success at the time. But what has been really wonderful is to watch it pull itself up by its own bootstraps through the years, because number one, the film looks unlike any other film in the history of film, and there'll never be a film that looks like it again. Its design is what has kept it afloat. You know, the story and things, it was okay, but the look of Tron, you know, you can say it anywhere, and so you can say, oh, it kind of looks like Tron, and they go, oh, you mean it looks like that computer? So the look, the design of Tron, I was exceptionally proud of, and how it evolved. And about, I don't know, 5, 8 years ago, the Visual Effects Society did a vote on all the films, all these special effects films through the history of film, to nominate the top 70 effects films in their order of priority. And Tron came in number 8 because it really was unique in so many ways. It just was not a big box office success at the time, but it is grown. It's more popular now than it was then. And then, of course, the sequel and there's stuff going on for the next one. But the point being, I was very proud of what we had pulled off. And we pulled it off in half the amount of time that we had. Tron come out when it was initially scheduled to come out at Christmas, it would have had a much, much bigger box office, and we could have refined it more. But we were given a mandate that it had to come out in July. And if you remember, that year was one of the most seminal years in the history of effects films. I mean, there was Blade Runner, Poltergeist, E.T., Das Boat, Dark Crystal, Conan, Firefox, The Thing, all those things came out, and E.T., and then at the very end of all those, here comes this Tron movie, when the world had fallen in love with E.T. and, you know, Bambi science fiction, and here comes Tron, and nobody knew about it, so it died. That was discouraging, but I'm very proud of it and proud of everybody that worked on it.
John, how did Tron affect your career, your life, or what does it mean to you?
Well, initially it was, you know, again, we were all like really browned out. It didn't do well. And it was just sort of like coming out of this year-long, you know, trench warfare battle. And you figure, we're alive, we won, now we'll show them. And nobody saw it. And so it was a disappointment on those levels. Because you know, we're basically, animators are slow motion performers, and you still want people to see your stuff. And so it was kind of a drag there. The other part of that was there had been so much resistance at Disney. It was sort of like, now we're going to show them, and they were like, ha, and which was kind of annoying. But the most frustrating part was after it came out, and because you're always showing your reel for the next gig, and I would show all these scenes I did on Tron, and they go, you didn't do that, that's the computer. And I got that over and over for years, going, no, this was done by hand. No, it wasn't. And I'm like, I wish I'd stolen the artwork to show them. But it was like, I lost a lot of credibility, because when you did a scene to bridge between computer and our world, or, you know, traditional stuff, if you did it really well, it would look like the computer made it. And I basically ended up with a lot of people saying you're a liar.
Well, Tron was not nominated. It should have been given a technical achievement award, which The Last Starfighter got years later. But the whole nomination progress, they literally thought the generalization was that we use computers and we cheat.
So we cheated.
Richard, I like that you have all those film titles memorized, those 10 big films that you were competing in.
Oh, right.
That was one hell of a year. That was like the like 1939 was for, you remember, the golden age of Hollywood. That was the super effects year, 82. When Tron ended, I have to say, I really didn't look back at all. I immediately went to Hong Kong to work on a film. I was put in charge of effects animation. In Hong Kong, I worked on a sword and sorcery fantasy film that had all kinds of glowing things and emperors and magic, and I had a lot of fun in Hong Kong for about 4 months, and I did that with Arnie Wong. And then I came back and worked on an Epcot film. I worked on a 3D film for Epcot with Murray Lerner. And
oh God.
Oh, yeah.
remember that one?
We're sorry.
I did a whole bunch of animation, 3D animation, which I did on a light box, literally crossing my eyes. Again, no computers, did it all by hand. I drew the right hand, and then I drew the right eye, drew the left eye. And
That was amazing, if I may say, to animate in 3D.
I did that.
I just never understood how you and others could do that.
I built a special light box, a big 22 field light box, double size, and I could cross my eyes. I had a sliding system where first I drew one eye, and then I would bring the page over, and through the paper, I would see the other eye, slide it, draw, slide, draw. It was, I invented that. I knocked out 9 seconds of electricity for Magic Journeys for Murray. So my career was just taking off. So things were coming up. I worked on, I don't know, Piranha and Airplane and Buckaroo Banzai and Dreamscape and a bunch of stuff. But I'd never been in that environment. Of course, nobody had working on Tron. It was certainly a big education to be in the studio, work in that system. I was always doing independent stuff, so it was a memorable experience to be on Tron. Great memories, great memories. And then to be on the lot, we could take a lunch in the back lot, walk through the Zorro set or the Something Wicked set. I also worked on Something Wicked immediately after that. I think I did a couple pilot scenes for Something Wicked and then zipped off to Hong Kong for that 4 months. And I came back and worked on Epcot. So it was a heady time. A lot of stuff was going on at the time.
It was a paradigm cultural shift.
Yeah, it
And
changed.
no one knew it at the
fashion,
time.
Changed industrial design, fashion, music videos, the Strokes. I mean, the list goes on of things that it affected, and mostly all visual.
Yeah. Unless you were there in the early 80s, it's really difficult to emphasize just how groundbreaking Tron was. I mean, it didn't just break the wall separating analog filmmaking and digital filmmaking, but it rebuilt it in such a way that showed that collaborative nature of what would become filmmaking of the future, of art and technology.
Yes.
And audiences and Hollywood wouldn't realize it until, like we said, in the 10 years later. In
The most
1990s.
powerful tool that has ever been invented, most powerful visual tool ever invented by mankind is computer simulation. And that's so apparent now. I mean, the fire, the water, the oceans, the forests, the photoreal human beings, the destruction, it's all CG. And, you know, I mean, yes, there are physical models now and then and a few things, but it's pretty much all computer simulated. Yeah. And that is a fact. It is the most amazing power. And it, as I said, it took half the time I thought it would take from Tron to Jurassic Park to have living creatures and foliage and, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's just amazing how it's the hardware and the software just keeps evolving.
That's right. Any final comments, Bill?
Yeah. Go ahead,
John?
Bill.
Oh, well, I just remember Steve Lisberger telling us at the beginning that we're going to feel like Lewis and Clark, you know, when they climbed up to the top of that mountain, they looked down and no one had ever seen that below them before. And he said, that's what we're going to be like. We're going to go into this computer world and we're going to start doing things that nobody's ever done before. And it's going to be, and you'll always remember that you did that. And he's totally right about that. And it has that merit of being first, and it has that merit of being the beginning of an age, like Richard said, that has changed the way all filmmaking and all image making is made. But I guess for those of us, at least for me, being the one in it, I guess, again, it was just that excitement of every day being Christmas morning, you know, and that's kind of how I always think of it.
Well, we were so lucky to have the combination of people that came together for that. You and Jerry and, you know, the guys here on the screen. But, you know, if you took all those films that we mentioned and took frames from each one and put them on a light box and put them across, you know, here's Blade Runner, here's ET, here's Poltergeist, they would all look gray and brown and grays and a tiny little bit of color. And then there'd be the Tron slide, which was like a neon, you know, icon in the middle of all this other outer space fiction and all those other, it just ripped a hole in the aesthetics of filmmaking.
That's the quote. That should have been on the poster.
That's it.
True.
There we go. Unless there's anything else, I think that's it.
Yeah, I got something real fast. I'm gonna, if you want, I'll
Please.
spool through something. I've got, I brought a camera onto the Disney lot, which was not allowed, and I grabbed a bunch of stuff, and I also kept a sketchbook, and I've got some of those here, and I'll spool through them real fast.
That's
You know,
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Now you go. Okay.
all right.
Oh.
Okay, this is the Disney guys going home. And every day, 5 o'clock, it was like the zombie alert, you know. This was when I first got to Disney. I realized that the place, it felt like it was being run by a drunken uncle, and so that's how this drawing happened.
Is that Ron Miller?
It was just the Disney culture. This I got minimum once a week. And they were just like, no, you can't do that. Walt wouldn't like that at every level.
Well, what's funny is that he'd been dead for 14 years by then.
I know, they were always saying he wouldn't like it. And I'd say, let's go to the basement, open the refrigerator and ask him. So, okay. And they were also, the rules were the rules and the union was the union. And so I started asking about the union sprocket hole puncher. And so I figured it was a guy in a back room just sitting there punching the holes every day. Okay, this is the airbrush trailers and some of the other trailers. It was the back slums.
Yeah. Well, they didn't give us offices because they hated us, and we were running out of room, and we had to get these trailers where Bill Arance and
Andy Atkins.
Andy Atkins were, and it was raining, and go out there and they're reaching and they're trying to airbrush. It was just so absurd.
It was like, sort of Appalachia in the back lot.
Yeah.
So this ended up on a T-shirt, which was eventually banned. So,
this is brilliant. I love it.
Okay, this is one of the tests we did for the when we were rezzing up and down. You can see all of this work here was basically hand drawn in. None of this existed. So we were basically faking it and putting all the grid patterns on all the characters. So that was an early test. And by the way, when you see the color transitions, that's because we laid them all out and hand inked each one to animate the colors up and down. Okay, that's Glenn Campbell.
Yeah, that's Glenn Campbell.
Yeah, I used to go down there on a regular basis because I had a union card for the camera, and I'd go down and go walk through the shots with him. But Glenn, I cannot say enough nice things about him. This guy was like the go-to guy.
Yeah, he's the best animation cameraman I've ever known.
Yeah, I worked with Glenn continuously after this, so we ended up being very, very good friends. This was our crew for a while, and it's about 15 of us, I guess, 15 or 16.
Some crazy people in there.
This is one of my assistants. This is Chris Cook.
Harry Cook.
He went on to be a director.
He directed Mulan.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And this is when we're playing with some of the highlights in the hall. You can see the boards out there, the storyboards. And Daryl Rooney.
Oh yeah. Oh man.
That's John Norden.
Yeah, he's still saying, "Damn grid bugs."
There's Jesse Silver. He was one of our background artists. Do you remember Gail? She was one of the first women to get a full animator credit at Disney, and I think there was one other during the Bambi era. But anyway, so we made up this award that sort of looked like the one of the props from Tron. So,
well, John,
I remember this guy.
John told me a story.
Ed Coffey.
John told me a story that he was talking to somebody and they were looking over his shoulder at the scene of when Sark gets his head split in half. And he said, you may be the first person to have ever animated a person dying on screen in a Disney film.
Yeah. Because the initial shot when Sark gets hit, we ran the Frisbee right through his skull. And so I did the first hit, and then Chris did all the clock parts flying all over. But I remember one of the Disney animators coming by and being amused and horrified at the same time and going, "Wow, I think you've done the first on-screen death of a Disney character." So anyway, and remember him?
That guy.
Look at that guy. He hasn't changed a bit.
Yeah, it was, I remember because it was raining out and you came in with a cell over your head and you're going to see, that's where technology is going to take us.
That's a rain hat. It's a cell rain hat.
That's Bill doing the airbrush, Bill Arance.
Yeah.
And that's John Norton and Dave Steffen, his assistant. And it's Dave trying to escape. And that's when we had a little animation get together in the back. And there's another one of our footage. What is with the goose? Do you remember?
Oh, that was a light that I had in my office that started getting moved around. It was a
Yeah, I was like, I just remember going, wait, there's a goose in here.
the goose lamp. Yeah, the goose lamp.
All right, that's there's Chris.
Am I in there? Maybe
And that's
There,
Les. That's how I looked on the show. So, all right. So how do I get out of this now?
Stop sharing.
Stop sharing. There we go.
Nice.
So anyway, that's
Well, that
my
was
journey
excellent.
down
Thank
memory
you for
lane.
sharing. That was awesome.
Nice archive. Cool. Nice.
Very nice.
So
Yeah.
I'm showing the stuff that won't get any of us convicted.
So cool.
So,
Too late now, statute of limitations.
yeah, well, we got a few. So anyway,
some of those
hey,
should
this
be
was
in
great. Thank you.
It
Well,
is.
Harrison, you didn't mention the pencil sharpener story, which is one of my favorites.
Pick it up and run, Harrison. Okay, now's your moment.
You got to tell them about it. This was Disney.
Very, very quickly, as I indicated earlier, I was basically the liaison between these hippies and crazy people, firing off fire extinguishers in the hall.
That wasn't us. That wasn't us.
Yeah, okay. It doesn't matter. It should have been you. But so I would get a call almost daily when I come into the office, and it would be the head of production or one of the Disney suits, and they'd have a list of complaints. And I just was so stupid. Eventually, the effects animators didn't have electric pencil sharpeners. They had hand, which was so stupid. And I went to the Disney guy, the Disney suit, and I said, we've got to, I'm going to put in a purchase order to buy electric pencil sharpeners. He looks at me and goes, we didn't have those on Snow White. Okay, well, what the hell is your So I circumvented the system, and everybody, I think everybody would share. So I just put it on the music budget, just go get pencil sharpeners. Jeez, stop it.
Oh, when they showed up, I mean, we were just like, oh, thank you. Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay. Yeah. It was a battle, but we found a way.
If it was good enough for Snow White, it's good enough for you.
Yeah, exactly. I don't regret any of it. It was so much fun, and I remember the difficult times, and we all shared them. And I don't think there was just wonderful people. Wonderful people.
Great time.
Well,
Really great.
and this was a wonderful afternoon. I really enjoyed spending this with you guys and hearing your stories and just celebrating Tron. And
Thank you.
So I look forward to going through this and editing it and hearing more of it as well in the days ahead. So
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, this was
Yeah,
great.
thanks for putting it together. It was a lot of fun. It's great to see everybody again.
Yeah.
Everybody's doing
Good
well.
to see you guys.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay,
take
well,
care.
maybe we'll see you at the Q&A, right?
Yeah.
and I'll keep in touch and then we'll see you at the Q&A. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Sign out,
Bye-bye.
boys. See you down the trail.
Well, welcome everybody. We are slowly opening the doors and guests are starting to come in and join us. Today, well, this year we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of TRON. Of course, TRON pioneered CG effects and graphic effects back 40 years ago, but well ahead of its time. 10 years really, because before Hollywood caught up. With us to discuss that and take your questions, and that's what we're really looking forward to, is Bill Croyer, who was the animation director John Van Vliet, the effects animator, Chris Cassidy, effects animator, and Richard Taylor, who was the co-visual effects supervisor overseeing all of those great CG effects. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice to be here.
40 years of Tron. Any observations you'd like to make personally before we invite questions?
Well, I would like to make a couple quick statements.
Okay.
I am totally amazed 40 years later at the effect that Tron has had on the motion picture industry and on entertainment in general. When I look back on it, if you remember, 1982 was an exceptional year for films, special effects films. Blade Runner, Poltergeist, E.T., Das Boat, Dark Crystal, Conan, Firefox, The Thing, and Tron. And of course, Tron was the firewall between analog and computer imaging as far as filmmaking. But I think the thing that most people don't really realize about Tron, the reason it has endured is really not so much about the story, it's the design. It's the design of Tron. It's the way it looked. And we really broke some ground then. And if you look at, if you take frames from films and put them on a light table and line them up, if you line all the other frames up from that year, they'll all look gray and dark and black. And Tron is like a neon sign.
Yeah.
Compared to everything else. And so it was extraordinary for its design. And the other one thing I'd like to say is that people don't really understand how much intensive hand-done labor went into making the film. The amount of work that an animation cameraman had to do just to do one frame, to lay all the artwork down, to change the exposures, change the filters, keep track of all that. We were animating light exposures by hand. It was all done by hand. So the film was literally handmade. It was not made by a computer.
Yeah. Just going to invite the audience to send their questions in and put them in the chat or directly through the Q&A as well. But we had this one interesting, again, I think the mindset 40 years later, they think that the CG pipeline has always been, we have this robust, our friend here from India is asking this, Harshad, what was it like setting up one of the first pipelines in modern CG? Well, there was no pipeline. That's the thing. Pipeline. Yeah.
There were 3 different companies that really did the raster graphics. And for the audience who's not familiar, raster graphics is when the computer started imitating the effect of light and making it a dimensional object, not vector lines, not line drawings, which is mostly what people had seen created by computers before Tron. But raster graphics, there was Magi Synthevision in Elmsford, New York. There was III, Information International Incorporated here in Los Angeles. And there was Digital Productions in New York, Judson Rosebush's company. And then Abels did one particular segment of the film, the real world to electronic world transition, but they did that all in camera with a vector system. Yeah. Anyway, so raster graphics, this was the beginning of it. And as you said, there was no Maya, there was no Max, there was no Lightwave, there was no Blender, there was no internet, there was no
software. Yeah.
There were no PCs. So Bill Croyer and Jerry Reese did a phenomenal job at interpreting camera moves to the technicians at the CG places to get the pitch, roll, and yaw and the X, Y, and Z position of every object in every frame was a master breakthrough that those boys did.
Yeah.
Well, not only were there no pipelines, but you have to realize every company that Richard mentioned had not only its own in-house proprietary private software, but they even had their different computers. And in the case of III, they built their own computer called the Foonly. So there was absolutely no such thing as file sharing. There was no commonality at all between these companies. It's as if Martians and Venetians and Andalusians had been called on to computer graphics, and they, with no contact with each other, came up with ways to do it. And that's what we were dealing with. And as I often point out to people, remember, there was no animation software. Nobody had yet written stuff to make things move. They wrote things to make things model and render in light. So when you're talking about animation in Tron, you're talking about rendering something in 24 different places to make 1 second of motion. So that's the craziness of that period.
I think that's what people don't appreciate. Like we call it the granddaddy of CG, but it's the CG. It was animation as well that made it look computer driven. And
well, that was part of the gauntlet that was laid down that I knew from the work I had been doing at Triple I and the work I did on Looker and Triple I sample reel, that the thing about computer animation was there are no physical limits to the objects nor to the camera. And so for Bill and Jerry to really design camera moves that would never have been tried with physical models or animation.
Yeah. Now, we have someone asking, why did the actors, I know the question to that or the answer to this, but you can explain it. Why did all the actors have black and white faces? Why was it lit in just in black and white?
Well, the way that the characters were stylized in the electronic world was a whole hand-done process that had evolved over years. Basically, we shot in 65 millimeter, the actors on a stage, everything on the stage was black and they were in white outfits with black costumes. That negative was then put in a photo enlarger that blew those frames up onto film that was made for us by Kodak, just for the film, that were 12 by 20 inches pieces of film that were pin registered, pre-punched, and we'd expose that and run it through a film processor, and you'd come back with a continuous tone positive image of that frame that was 12 inches by 20 inches that you could hold up and put on a light table. And then that was contact printed to high con film. High con is totally opaque black and clear to make other positives and negatives. Those were painted out to isolate the different areas of the character, the body itself, the flesh of the face and hands, the color of the circuits, and the whites of the eyes and the teeth. Those were all individual exposures. What people need to understand is that Tron, all of the electronic world live action characters were created with backlight on animation cameras. There was no computers involved in any form. It was not computer processed. It was literally multi-exposures on 18 different cameras that had the same light boxes and then the same filters. And that's why when I say the amount of work that it took to do Tron, just what an animation cameraman had to do, looking at that exposure sheet and laying all those layers of film down on the platen, getting the right filter on the camera, the right exposures, because we were animating light. If you remember in Tron, whether it was the effects animation or whatever, exposures were blooming and then going back. So we were using that as a language.
Yeah. It
Somebody asked about the 2010 version.
Yeah.
And,
yeah. So when you look at 2010 Tron.
Well, two comments about that. First of all, a single frame of that movie had more rendering time and more rendering power than the entire 1980 film. And,
yeah, exactly.
And secondly, I personally like, my favorite part of that film was Steve Lisberger as the bartender.
Right.
So it was nice to see a beard in the digital world.
As Bill said, just the particles in one frame of Legacy was more computing than was in all of Tron.
Yeah, and if you want to see more about what Richard's talking about, we had the 2-hour interview and the session, and they kindly gave us all the background film and story about that black and white and the shooting and that. I want to bring in Chris and John into this conversation as well, because you were doing the visual effects. And when we think about visual effects today, it's all about digital, but you guys learned it in the practical world, and it was hand-drawn visual effects. Can you want to talk about those visual effects for Tron?
Well, unlike today, the entire time I was on Tron, I never touched a keyboard. So there was zero typing involved at my end, and everybody keeps asking, what was your favorite software? And I say Ticonderoga 2.0, which is my favorite pencil. And it was, it all started when, Richard brought me into this big room of concept art. There's like Sid Mead, there was Mobius, who was some of the other guys?
Peter Lloyd.
Peter Lloyd. and I walked into this room, and it was like, every artist that I had ever, basically dreamed of being or, working around. And it's like, okay, who do I got to kill to work on this picture? And as Richard said, this is where we want to go. We're not quite sure how we're going to get there. You interested? And I was like, yeah, oh, okay, sure. And then we got into it. So it was a lot of innovation on that picture. We made things up as we went, and unlike most other pictures, there was a phenomenal amount of trust.
Well, one thing I want to say in regard to John and to Chris, they were the effects animators, the alpha ones of all of them. And what people don't understand, every disc streak, every explosion, the sparks, when TRON is, when Jeff Bridges is de-resed and taken down into the community, all of that effects animation was done by hand by these gentlemen.
Yeah. Chris?
And we're still tired.
Yeah, I can just concur and agree and repeat the same thing. Everything we did in the effects animation department was entirely hand done. We were in the old Disney animation building on Dopey Drive on the Disney lot. We were in an entire wing of the building. We all had the classic Disney desks, and it was an honor to sit at a Disney desk. I didn't feel like I was worthy enough to sit at a Disney desk. These are the actual desks, that Walt had designed, that the great Disney features had been made at. And if you were lucky, you scored one of these desks. We had this.
Oh, Bill's got his still. Look at that. Oh, Bill, I'm jealous.
You've got a Disney desk.
That's an heirloom.
Would you sneak that out under your coat?
Yeah.
I think they were selling them for a period of time.
Must have some clout. Yeah, weren't they liquidating them at one point, Bill? Were they liquidating
They
them?
were, yeah, they were getting rid of them. And
That's what I remember, yeah.
I know we're going to end pretty soon. I'd like to sneak in one comment to address a thing in the chat. What advice can you give to the newer effects generation? And I think it's something that all of us here learned on TRON, and that is the simple phrase, never be seduced by technology. Technology is advancing in tremendous ways, and now we have the ability with all this new software and hardware to do really remarkable visuals. But I would like to just say to the younger effects people, simply being a tool user and knowing how to use that technology is not the secret. At the end of the day, it's always the personal artistry that you bring to it. And as John Van Vliet said, a personal artist with a number 2 pencil can outperform somebody with $1 billion piece of software. So the one thought I will give to you, and I think we all learned that, is that no matter how sophisticated and complicated the technology becomes, always try to improve your own personal taste and vision as an artist who's expressing a beautiful message to the audience.
Right.
Oh, well put. And I remember,
like Bill is saying, pianos don't play themselves. Maya and Max, they don't play themselves. It takes the human spirit and the imagination of artists like
exactly.
Bill was discussing.
It's true.
Yeah, no, I really like that. Richard was saying that before in another conversation about pianos, because it's a tool that can be sit there, but only in the hands of an artist does it really come alive, right? And so, we can all have a piano in our homes, those tools, the CG tools and software, but a real artist is going to make it shine. So this is why this film holds up as well, so well, because when we think about it as well, we forget that aspect. It was a Disney film, and then the animators were they were some of the best working on it. So let's see, we have someone here. Let's see, a couple of new comments here. Yeah, don't let all AI take it. Did you realize you guys were doing something new at the time? Did it seem like this was something new and exciting?
Oh yeah,
or
it was very obvious to me. I remember thinking there was a general excitement among the whole crew that we were doing something amazing. I think we thought it would be a lot bigger than it was when it came out. Clearly the look was unique. We'd never seen anything like that. We had a strong feeling that this is going to make a big splash. The visuals were obviously maverick and original. John, don't you think so? There was a lot of excitement. I thought we're working on something amazing. Yeah.
The biggest problem was you knew you were working on something that just was a game changer, but it was also you're battling the fatigue because we're doing 80, 90 hours a week.
Yeah.
But, at a certain point, you realize we could be the meteor that hit the Yucatan, and we could be wiping out dinosaurs, which ultimately the ripples did do. So it changed the world.
Well,
In a way, Tron was a couple of years ahead of its time.
You have to know the history of it all, but Tron was very poorly marketed. There are a lot of backstories about why it was or was not a box office success, but it has endured. And that's one of the things the Visual Effects Society voted several years ago on the top effects films in the history of film, the top 70. And Tron ended up number 8 out of 70.
Wow.
One of the most influential films. That's the thing. It still holds up. So while it wasn't a financial success in its day, we look at here we are, as we said before, 40 years later, we're talking about it. And
It was
if not for
ahead of
Tron-
its time.
There was a question in the chat about
Yeah.
the bit. I'd just like to quickly address the question
ahead,
about the bit and the grid bugs. The bit was a bit was a wonderful example of what we called synergistic creativity between the artists and the technologists, where the artists had no idea what the technology could do at all. We were constantly learning. And it was discovering the idea of interpenetrating shapes that was brand new to us that gave us this idea for the bit. It was simple as that. We saw that weird thing where shapes could penetrate and make new shapes. And we thought, why not make a Tinkerbell character with that personality? And that's how that came about. And the grid bugs, which very perceptive of you to note the hand-drawn aspect of that. That is really the only hand-drawn animation of a character in the film. And originally all of Tron was going to be hand-drawn, but when computers came along, we changed it. And the grid bugs were the last almost homage to that thing. There was an animator named John Norton, who was one of the original Lisberger animators who came out from Boston, worked on Animal Olympics, did tests on the original Tron. Steve Lisberger let John Norton's grid bug make it into the movie, even though it really has nothing whatsoever to do with anything at all. It's just right in the middle of the sea.
Right.
And it's just kind of a fun little secret homage to that, the art of hand drawing.
Yeah. Well, you guys have given us something very, very special to remember, and its impact is still being felt today. It's been wonderful spending time with you. These past couple of interviews, I've really enjoyed it. And again, I'm going to encourage all of the pass holders and conference holders to go and see this great interview with these 4 gentlemen, plus Harrison Ellenshaw, and behind the scenes and all the shots that they shared. It's just amazing. And the story behind the making of Tron and celebrating its 40th anniversary. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, John. Thank you, Richard and Chris. It's been excellent getting to know you and spending time with you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And, all I can say, it was an incredible honor to work with these gentlemen.
Hey, we were delighted to be there.
Back at
Thank
you.
you.
It was an honor to be on that crew, and I learned a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.